Abraham, I just want to introduce you.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, good to see you. Thank you very much. In 1989, Abraham, like many Southern Sudanese, became a refugee in Ethiopia, where he joined the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, at roughly the age of 10. So he was a child soldier when he joined the SPLA. And then progressed. He went to Kenya and the United States of America, and as I said, went as the Lost Boys of Sudan. He went through the American educational system and institution, and when Sudan voted for independence in January 2000, became independent country, 2011, Alowich returned to the South as a consultant to the government. And he worked briefly in the Ministry of Defense as Deputy Director for Policy Planning from 2011 to 2012, before moving to the Sud Institute in South Sudan. Then he was appointed in January 2021, last year, as a Deputy Rapporteur for the Upper Nile Conference. And then on the 30th of July, the same year, Alowich and 3 other colleagues signed a declaration of the founding of the People's Coalition for Civil Action, PCCA, a South Sudan-based pro-democracy civil rights movement. Alowich left South Sudan in October 2021 and returned to the United States, where he is currently running an advocacy campaign. So, Abraham, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. And greetings to all of you. I'm delighted that I could have this moment. Just got off the plane. And so if I rumble a little bit, it's a result of that. But it is really an opportunity for us to share our views. And so today my presentation is on the myth and truth about South Sudanese identities, national identity. And as I talk about identity, identity, of course, is a very important human attribute. It has enabled human society to conquer the world in which they live because of the ability of people to cooperate on the basis of identity. But identity also has had some devastating results also in the lives of human race. These are things to do with war, conflict, a lot of discrimination, things to do with slavery, and so forth. These are also results of identity. And today, I'm taking this issue because I believe that South Sudan is also experiencing some identity crisis. And breaking up out of Sudan, the reason for the breakup of Sudan was a result of identity crisis as well. And so even though the identity crisis in the Sudan is not the same as the one in South Sudan, the results are similar. Whereas in the old Sudan, the dividing factors were religion and race. Africans versus the Arabs, Muslims versus Christians and other people who profess other faiths. And but in South Sudan, the identity is along ethnic lines. You have Nuers, you have Dinkas, you have Shilluk, you have the Baris, the Zandes. And so talking about identity in this context, the purpose is for us to understand that when identity is poorly managed, it results in conflict and dismemberment of a country. But when it is well managed, it can lead to prosperity. So, so my presentation is broken into 3 parts. The first part is just a background of what it is that we mean when we talk about identity. And second part will be looking specifically at the origins of the South Sudanese national identity. And the last part will be dealing with what is going on with the identity now in South Sudan, and why I believe ethnic identity is overshadowing the emergence of national identity. And therefore, the current political crisis in the country can be attributed to how identities are defined and what we choose to give emphasis to. And so that is largely what my presentation is going to look like. This paper is developed out of a research that I conducted in 2016. It was a field research. We were trying to basically understand how people perceive identity in South Sudan. And so we collected some data, and our purpose for the study at the time was to understand the challenge of national unity in South Sudan. And so the results were largely to inform public policy, partly the national policy that led to the national dialogue creation. But the paper is also informed by the review, literature review, of a lot of study done by many psychologists and cultural psychologists and anthropologists, as well as political scientists. Issues of identity have been well studied over the years. And so as a start, we need to understand what is an identity, just briefly. And a lot of psychologists and anthropologists have studied this and said that identity is basically a simple categorization, categorizing people as this group that we belong to and that group we don't belong to. It is essentially an artificial, arbitrary distinction. Basically, people identifying as this and people identifying as that. But even though it is arbitrary, it can create a lot of positive impact. So a lot of people can self-identify to do a lot of great things. And example is that nation states, of course, are forms of identity. So big countries like the United States, like China, are based on identity. So they identify as Chinese, and the other people identify as American people. But identity also can be so small. You know, it could be at the family level. We are a lineage of so-and-so. And our ancestor was this great person. So there is a mix of self-identification and some myth about how our common ancestry or common history brought us together. And then there are certain attributes that are shared by people. Now, the problem is that when groups formation takes place and people self-identify, there is sometimes conflict that is generated by those who are excluded. There is an element of exclusion. So we are group so-and-so, and the other group is group so-and-so, therefore they are excluded. So when there is an exclusion, conflict can be generated. But when identity is expansive and inclusive, a lot of unity, a lot of cooperation is achieved. So I want to quote Robinson. Robinson says that if we think of building a national identity, unlike ethnic identity, as a stable form of identity, then we have to recategorize as a people. We have to move away from categorizing ourselves, for example, as people of this ethnic community, to now people of this nation. So we have to constantly recategorize ourselves as a group in order to create a new identity. So, because identity, when it is well played, leads to larger social organizations and leads to higher forms of cooperation, which are important both in building an economy and building a peaceful society. As well, identities when they are properly managed, they tend to lower transaction costs among the groups, and therefore leading to more prosperity when the identities are constructed positively. I want to jump because time is limited. I want to jump to the discourse, the debate that many intellectuals have had around this issue of identity and how nations are formed as a basis of identity. And many of you may be familiar with Benedict Anderson's imagined communities. And because Anderson believes that a nation basically is a construct, is an identity that is constructed and it is imagined. And this is true. So most of identities are mythical. They are imagined, and then they are promoted. And so nation states are a result of identities that are imagined and constructed. But there are other people who believe that it is not all about imagination. Nation states and national identities are a result of conflict, of war. And so when people fight, one group identify as one, and the other group fighting the other group identifies as another. And in the long run, such divisions lead to the formation of nations. And so identity formation is also a result of war. And but others believe that identity formation is a result of history, common ancestry and symbolism and cultural facts and cultural values. So it is not necessarily imagined, it is actually developed through long historical interactions among citizens or among the groups. And so that is one group of researchers. Basically, they call themselves cultural constructivists or ethno-symbolists. They believe that it is a symbolic development of myth and common history and common culture that leads to the formation of national identity. And so, anyway, I will not dwell so much on this debate, but what I want to point out is that regardless of how people look at identity, in terms of how they define it, the most important characteristic is that identity is a construction of a common purpose. It is created to create a commonality and membership among various group of people, and they can identify with the nation. And so that is the most important part of the of identity. And now let me leave the bigger debate and let me focus on South Sudan. South Sudan is a nation that has emerged out of deep-rooted historical calamity of marginalization and exploitation, persecution and enslavement by various colonial government and various Khartoum-based Sudanese regimes. So this experience invokes the thinking of perennialist view of state formation, that South Sudan, while that is true, South Sudan also is a country that has come out of 50 years of civil wars between the North and the South, and followers of different religions, which will also support those researchers who believe that countries are developed or identities are developed out of war. And of course, the people of South Sudan, of course, share a common experience of oppression and war, and it is perhaps the similarities of their cultures and beliefs, as well as the elites expounding on the sameness and shared heritage that probably gave rise to nationalism and identity formation in South Sudan as well, which, of course, bring on board the constructivists and modernists as well, in terms of their perspective. Debates can enrich our understanding of the generic concept of a nation or national identity and the realization, at least in part, that a nation emerged of a mosaic of backgrounds. And so that is basically what is, that is the most important information, that a nation can come out of various interactions, as exemplified by the complexity that we have just narrated on South Sudan. So the lesson that we can draw from the analysis of identity crisis in the Sudan conflict is threefold. First, what divided the people of Sudan on the basis of race into Arabs and Africans was largely a myth that overshadowed a more uniting reality. Second, that there was much that united the people that needed to be explored and built upon. And third, that however fictitious the identity factors that divide the people of one country, what was critically important was constructive management of diversity aimed at inclusivity and equality without discrimination on the ground of race, ethnicity, religion, or culture. So in light of the challenges inherent in the definition of a nation and nationalism, and given the convoluted process of which South Sudan came into existence, it is appropriate to ask, is South Sudan a nation? Both the political elites and scholars have attempted in a number of ways to define South Sudan as a nation. First, South Sudan is defined racially and linguistically as a nation of Black African tribes. Second, it is defined in terms of collective historical suffering of its people under various oppressive regimes. And third, over the course of 2 civil wars with the Sudan, the people of South Sudan have also been described in terms of their religious beliefs, making it a nation of Christians and believers of indigenous religions. As indicated, even by this criteria, what differentiated the people of South Sudan from other groups in the Sudan was a matter of degree and subjective self-perception. So indeed, the driving theoretical base of the new Sudan vision was to free the country as a whole from the divisive myth of identity and forge a new commonality based on shared historical and contemporary realities. So the deep-rooted myth proved too challenging to eradicate, except gradually by those more directly affected and across sections of the whole Sudan. So after independence, South Sudan is now defined as a civic nation. So the Constitution of South Sudan, for example, defines South Sudan as a sovereign and independent republic with a geographical entity that falls south of the Sudan and covering the area of the three regions of Equatoria and Upper Nile and Barghazal, Palazabie. So South Sudan started as a country that was defined in terms of the collective suffering, but now is being defined as a civic nation. So the identity is transforming from one that looks at self-identification in opposed to others, now to a civic identity based on the objective characteristic of the country. So we are trying to move away now from how we used to identify ourselves in opposition to others, to now identifying ourselves in terms of the civic identity formation. So we move on. I will not dwell too much on this.
Sorry, we have to stop really, Abraham, because we got the last speaker in time. So if I could give you 2 minutes to wind up your discussion, I'll be very grateful.
Excellent. Let me conclude by saying that the idea that I'm trying to present here is that South Sudan is going through a identity transition, an identity transition that looked at ourselves as a nation from the collective suffering that we have been subjected to, now to moving to a nation that tries to define itself as a civic nation. And we are struggling with that as a country. The opportunity that we had to build a more cohesive, a more unifying identity, we lost that opportunity. And that opportunity got lost because of the violent political power contests among the political elites, who are not pursuing political power on the basis of ideology, but pursuing power on the basis of ethnic identification. And so giving rise to highlighting or putting more emphasis on things that divide us as ethnic groups, than putting emphasis on things that unite us. And so the conclusion is that South Sudan is likely to suffer from the same identity crisis because identity is being built on the basis of what divides rather than on the basis of what unites. So the conflict that we are experiencing, as well as the political crisis that we are experiencing, is a result of that mismanagement and also emphasis on things that divide people. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time, and I'm very sorry that I had to rumble around. If you were to sit on my back of the computer, you would see what is going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abraham, for joining us. And we are sorry to have to cut you off in terms of for finishing your detailed analysis of the question of identity. Thank you very much. Richard.
I would like to put questions to you, Abraham. You didn't talk about the national dialogue, and obviously it wasn't central to the subject on which you were speaking, but since you yourself had a considerable role in the national dialogue, I hope it's appropriate to ask you about this. Speakers today in the conference have largely been silent about the national dialogue. they have not mentioned it. For example, Rita Lapidia, in her presentation about the revitalized agreement and its many extensions, her presentation didn't mention the revitalized agreement, which obviously was a parallel peace initiative happening at the same time as the negotiation of the revitalized agreement. Justin Tata, one of the online audience, said, oh, since it's clear that the revitalized agreement is heading down the drain. So to you, Abraham, since you took part in the national dialogue, and the national dialogue, do you think that it had strengths that remain valid today compared with the revitalized agreement? Did the national dialogue have strengths that are valid today, even though the national dialogue conclusions, its final report, with its recommendations about elections, the government...
Abraham, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I will not be long. I can say yes, the national dialogue is valid and will continue to be valid for a long time, because it is a deliberation and an agreement of the ordinary people of South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you.